Now that we've had a pretty detailed look at the central nervous system and the brain and the spinal cord and all the structures in between, we're going to dive into all the stuff outside of the central nervous system by looking at the peripheral nervous system. So very simply, the peripheral nervous system is literally all of the nerve fibers located outside of the CNS. And so if I was to highlight the CNS right now in green and say that the green here represents the brain and the spinal cord, so again, extending down to about the second lumbar vertebrae, all the way from the brain. In yellow, we have all of the nerves. So literally, the peripheral nervous system is much larger than the central nervous system. And it extends all the way through the body. You'll notice we've also got some facial nerves in here. And all of these nerves, all of these cell bodies are located in ganglia, okay, which are groups of nerve cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So let's talk about the cranial nerves first. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now, I've included a diagram over on the right. Do you need to know these? No. Okay. The only one that might pop up from time to time, especially when we're looking at the medulla oblongata and sensation of breathing and the lungs feeling full, is the vagus nerve. But apart from that, we don't need to worry about them. It's worth noting that all of these cranial nerves can be sensory, motor, or mixed nerves, where they're both sensory and motor. Next down is our spinal nerves. And our spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are all mixed nerves. Okay, so all of them contain both sensory and motor pathways. And that's what we looked at in our prior lesson, 2 lessons ago, when we looked at the dorsal root and the ventral root. So the dorsal root carrying that sensory neuron, as we can see, thanks to the the dorsal root ganglion, which contains the sensory nerve cell body, and then the ventral root and the absence of that root ganglion, as the ventral root contains the motor nerve cell body in the grey matter of the spinal cord. Now, when we're talking about these roots, very simply, again, the ventral root contains the motor neuron, the dorsal root contains the sensory neuron. Okay. So here's another representation of that one, similar to what we saw the other day. The only thing that's different in this diagram, if we start off, we can see that the sensory neuron is going to bring this information into the spinal cord. Something that is new for us that we haven't seen represented previously, and I'll highlight it in yellow now, is this interneuron, so this connector, before a message is sent back out from the spinal cord via the ventral root. And what we eventually get, maybe I'll circle this one in blue over here, is eventually the sensory and the motor both combine in this spinal nerve. So when we're saying a spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, this is what we're referring to here. Now, the peripheral nervous system, similar to, in a way, how the brain and spinal cord can be divided into the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can be divided not so much based on its structures, because it's just a whole bunch of nerves, but more based on its function. And so we have 2 main divisions. The first division is what we call the afferent, or the sensory division, and the second is what we know as the efferent, or motor division. So if we zoom in a little bit now on our diagram, we can see firstly the afferent division over on the left-hand side, and it carries information into the central nervous system. So I'm going to really highlight that arrow moving into the central nervous system. We can get information from 2 main centres. Firstly, we can get it from our skin and our muscles, so what we call the somatic sensory system, and we can also get it from our internal organs, so what we call the visceral sensory system. Okay. From there, we then look at the other side. So the message is coming out from the spinal cord, and this is what we call the efferent division. And this is carrying information away from the central nervous system. Where's it carrying it to? Well, number 1, it can carry it to the somatic division, which again is going to be our muscles, okay, and our skeletal muscles, what we have conscious control over. And then number 2, we have what is known as the autonomic division. Okay, so this is carrying messages to all of the involuntary structures, so glands and even things like cardiac muscle, which we don't have conscious control over. From there, it can also be divided into 2 separate groups. We have both the sympathetic and we have the parasympathetic division of the autonomic portion. Okay, now the parasympathetic you can think of as your rest and digest. So this is processes that are going to help you when you're not being active and exercising. And then we can also think of the sympathetic division as kind of the polar opposite to that. We're talking fight or flight. Okay, so really stressful situations, and we'll talk more about the symptoms and what these things look like in a second. Okay. So when we're talking autonomic nervous system, again, the main thing that I need you to know is that it is largely involuntary control of all of these muscles, glands, internal organs. Okay, so we're largely talking now about the endocrine system and now maintenance of homeostasis. The autonomic nervous system is controlled by a number of key structures that we've looked at previously: the medulla oblongata for our breathing, our hypothalamus for our temperature and thirst, and our cerebral cortex more generally. So some of the really important things that we can look for when we're looking at the parasympathetic and sympathetic comparison of the autonomic divisions is heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, pupils, changes to them. Okay, they're really easy to contrast. So what I've done here is I've contrasted them for you. So we have the autonomic and we have the somatic division. Now, this isn't the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic, but this is looking at what you have conscious control over versus what you have unconscious control over. So if we're looking, I'm going to circle the two main parts here. So autonomic being involuntary control and somatic being voluntary control. When we then jump on down and we again look at the visual representation of this, we can see in the somatic pathway that the nerve cell body is located in the grey matter. And this is the same as in the autonomic pathway. Okay. The difference arises with the use of the neurotransmitters. Okay, so in the somatic pathway, we're going to use the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, okay, and the effectors are going to be skeletal muscle. When we move on down into the autonomic pathway, however, okay, the neurotransmitter can be acetylcholine again, or this time noradrenaline, adrenaline. Okay, I'll highlight what's in common in yellow there. So acetylcholine is shared, but noradrenaline is distinct. Now the effectors, again, heart muscle, cardiac muscle, which is under involuntary control, other involuntary muscle, so you can think smooth muscle within blood vessels, and we also have glands, so like endocrine glands or sweat glands, you name it. When we then dive down into the parasympathetic versus sympathetic, okay, the neurotransmitter is again really important. So the neurotransmitter in the parasympathetic system is acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter in the sympathetic system is noradrenaline. Now, the reasoning for this is during the parasympathetic system, this is going to be triggered during relatively quiet periods. Okay, so maybe you're sitting down on the couch at the end of the day after you've done a long day of study and your body is trying to relax and de-stress. When we're looking at fight or flight, however, this is your body's ability to respond to stressful situations. And these stressful situations could be environmental, they could be psychological, emotional, or physical. Now, it's really important to note that under everyday conditions, we're not aware of this activity. These two systems complement one another and they work together in order to maintain a nice homeostasis within your body. Okay? And it's only when an environmental, psychological, emotional, or physical stress is really applied that then the sympathetic nervous system is going to become dominant over the parasympathetic system, because again, normally they're working together. So, what are some examples? So, anything in a fight or flight scenario that's going to involve fear, anger, stress, danger, or competition can evoke that fight or flight response. Okay? And what it's going to do is it's going to encourage particular organs and tissues around your body to respond in a very particular way to help you reduce non-essential functions and also to achieve its possible best. So what I've got here is a very long list comparing the effect of sympathetic versus parasympathetic stimulation. So again, in the instance of, let's say, you're getting hunted by a bear in the woods. Dramatic, I know, but hopefully one that will stick with you. In terms of your heart rate, well, you'd hope that your heart rate would increase and that the heartbeat would increase its strength of contraction. Your bronchioles are going to dilate to increase the amount of air coming into the lungs. Your stomach and your intestines, they're not really useful at that point in time, so the energy going from you moving feces through the stomach and intestines is not going to be as important. When we talk about the liver, this is something that we talk about significantly more with homeostasis, but we're going to increase the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. We're going to dilate the pupils so you've got a greater field of view. We're going to increase how much sweat to make sure that we can thermoregulate. When we look at the blood vessels, we're going to constrict our blood vessels, okay, towards the skin. We're going to dilate our blood vessels to our muscles so that we can get lots of oxygen and nutrient going to our muscles, okay? On the other side, parasympathetic, much slower. When we're talking about parasympathetic, you're resting, you're digesting, your heart rate goes down. It doesn't need to beat as tough either, okay? Your bronchioles, your lungs, they don't need to inflate to their maximum capacity. Your stomach is going to increase its movement, okay? The reason it's going to increase its movement is we're not under any real pressure, so the stomach muscles can take over, they can do more of their job here, okay? Now, hopefully you're not sweating, hopefully your body is rather cool, your pupils don't need to dilate, you don't need that excessive field of view. Now, when we're talking about the effect of blood vessels, there's going to be a little effect to skin, and there's going to be thermoregulatory, if anything. And when we're talking about internal organs, again, a little effect, but nothing major, okay? When we get to the final thing, this is what I've saved for last, is the adrenal medulla. Under parasympathetic stimulation, there is no real effect on the adrenal medulla. However, under sympathetic stimulation, hormone secretion, namely adrenaline, noradrenaline, is stimulated by the adrenal medulla in order to lead to a longer lasting endocrine response to this fight or flight stimulation. So what I'll do here is I'll leave you on this last little slide. Again, you can take a screenshot from this one. Parasympathetic innervation versus sympathetic innervation, how these two systems differ when they're not normally just working together.